The sun should have risen hours ago, yet the sky above the Pelennor hangs heavy, a bruised and suffocating ceiling of sorcerous fumes. This is the Dawnless Day, a tactical masterstroke designed to negate the primary advantage of men, hope. Below this unnatural twilight, the fields of the Pelennor have been churned into a gray slurry of ash and blood. The air itself tastes of sulfur and rotting carrion, carrying the screech of the Nazgul, a sound that acts less like a battle cry and more like a psychological weapon, stripping the courage from soldiers' bones before the first sword is even swung. Inside the great circle of Minas Tirith, the garrison is nearing total collapse. This is not merely a siege, it is a suffocation. Great catapults, unseen in the gloom, rhythmically hurl incendiary shot and severed heads over the ramparts, spreading fire and disease in a calculated campaign of attrition. The defenders are paralyzed, their command structure fracturing under the weight of despair. They are no longer an army, they are trapped rats waiting for the end. Then, the rhythm of the bombardment changes. The erratic thud of stone gives way to a singular rhythmic doom. Gron has arrived. The wolf's head, a massive battering ram bound with spells of ruin, crawls toward the great gate. Iron and spell-wrought steel collide. Once, twice, thrice, the blast is blinding. The gate of the citadel, inviolate for generations, shatters like brittle glass. As the Witch King rides under the archway that no enemy has ever passed, the defenders of Gondor face a grim mathematical certainty. Oh, their static defense has failed. They are isolated, outflanked, and staring into the abyss of extinction. To understand the slaughter that was about to unfold, one must first understand the geometry of the battlefield. Minas Tirith was not merely a city, it was a fortress carved from the living rock of Mindoluin, the last hard point anchoring the defense of the West. Strategically, it acted as the cork in the bottle. If the city fell, the armies of Mordor would flood across the Anduin River, sweeping through Rohan and Eriador unchecked. The Witch King of Angmar, serving as Sauron's supreme field commander, understood this perfectly. His objective was not simple conquest. It was the total erasure of Gondor's military capacity. The siege lines established by the host of Mordor were a textbook example of aggressive circumvallation. In the days preceding the breach of the gate, the enemy had not been idle. They had dug deep, carving trenches filled with fire and sharpened stakes across the Pelennor Fields. These were not random acts of vandalism. They were calculated counter-mobility operations. The Witch King anticipated that aid might come from the north, and these earthworks were designed to break the momentum of any relieving cavalry force, turning a charge into a massacre. Numerically, the disparity was catastrophic. Inside the walls, the garrison, reinforced by the levies from the southern fiefs like Dol Amroth, numbered perhaps less than 10,000 effective combatants. Outside, the plain was choked, with an estimated 60,000 orcs, trolls, and human tributaries. But the true danger lay in the composition of the enemy force. The core of Mordor's army was heavy infantry, designed for grinding attrition, supported by siege artillery that outranged the city's trebuchets. Furthermore, hidden in the reserve were the Easterlings and the Varyags of Khan, fresh, disciplined troops waiting to exploit the inevitable breach. Gondor's defensive strategy had already suffered a critical failure before the first stone hit the city. The Ramas Ekor, the great outer wall encircling the farmlands of the Pelennor, had been lost too quickly. By failing to hold this outer perimeter, the defenders allowed the enemy to bring their heavy siege engines right up to the walls of the city itself. This collapsed the battlefield depth, denying the Gondorians any room to maneuver or sort their logistics. They were compressed into a kill box, cut off from the river and blinded by the supernatural gloom. However, The outcome of battles is often decided by logistics and intelligence far from the front lines. To the north, the Rohirrim were engaged in the most desperate forced march in their history. King Théoden was moving 6,000 heavy cavalry across rugged terrain. In military terms, moving a mounted division of that size requires immense logistical discipline. Fodder, water, and organization are as vital as swords. But speed was their armor. They were racing against the fall of the city. Here, the strategic theme of the battle shifts from attrition to intelligence. The Witch King had deployed a massive blocking force of orcs and Easterlings on the main road from Rohan, at the choke point where the road creates a natural ambush. Had Théoden ridden down that road, the riders of Rohan would have been bottled up and destroyed long before seeing the White City. The entire relief effort hinged on a single piece of local intelligence. The wild men of the Druadan forest, led by Gan Borigan, revealed the existence of the Stonewain Valley, an ancient, forgotten logistical artery used by the Gondorian stone haulers of old. By utilizing this primitive route, the Rohirrim bypassed the enemy's blocking force entirely. This was the masterstroke of the campaign. It allowed Théoden to insert a massive heavy cavalry force into the enemy's rear area without being detected. The Witch King, for all his dark sorcery, suffered a catastrophic intelligence failure. He assumed the Rohirrim were blocked or days away. He was focused entirely on the crushing of the city, his eyes fixed on the breaking of the gate. As the Grond battered down the doors and the Witch King rode in, the vast army of Mordor was oriented inward toward the burning city. Their backs were turned to the north. The stage was set for a collision between the static, grinding weight of Mordor and the kinetic, violent momentum of the north. The trap was sprung, but not the one the Dark Lord had intended. The turning point of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields began not with a sword stroke, but with a shift in the wind. North. For days, the sour currents of Mordor had blown west, carrying the smoke of Orodruin to choke the sun. But as morning broke, a sea breeze from the south cut through the gloom. The unnatural twilight tore open, and in that sudden clarity, the tactical blindness of the enemy was exposed. From the northern ridge of the Ramas Ekor, the sound was felt before it was heard. A low vibration in the earth, growing into a thunder that drowned out the din of the siege engines. Then came the horns. Not the harsh brazen trumpets of Mordor, but the wild, singing horns of the north. Here's King Théoden had arrived. The tactical situation at this moment is a study in shock action. The army of Mordor was deployed for an assault on a fixed position, the city. Their siege towers were forward, their pikes were oriented west, and their heavy infantry was packed into the fire trenches near the walls. They were dense, immobile, and utterly unprepared for a high-speed assault on their right flank. Théoden did not hesitate. There was no parley, no intricate maneuvering for better ground. He understood that his only advantage was momentum. He ordered a general charge across the entire front. 6,000 spears lowered in unison. The Rohirrim hit the northern wing of the enemy line like an iron hammer striking glass. The initial impact was catastrophic for the besiegers. Lightly armored orcs and skirmishers were simply vaporized by the kinetic energy of the heavy cavalry. The Rohirrim didn't just break the line, they rode over it. The northern half of the Pelennor became a killing field. The neat geometric formations of the orcs dissolved into a chaotic rout. They were driven into the fire trenches they had dug themselves, trampled into the mud by the thousands. For a brief, glorious hour, it seemed that speed and fury alone would win the day. But warfare is rarely linear. As the momentum of the charge dissipated, as horses tired and lances shattered, the deeper layers of the Mordor stratagem revealed themselves. The Witch King, though his gate breaching was interrupted, had not lost control of the field. He deployed his heavy reserves, the Haradrim. If the Rohirrim were the kinetic spearhead, the Haradrim were the armored wall. Their cavalry was numerous, But their true strength lay in the Mumakil, the great war Oliphants. Tactically, these beasts functioned as mobile fortresses, impervious to arrows and terrifying to horses. A horse will not charge a living mountain. The Rohirrim's advance slammed to a halt against these behemoths. The battle devolved from a maneuver-based rout into a static, bloody brawl. The riders were pulled from their saddles. The fluid grace of the charge was replaced by the ugly, hacking work of close-quarters melee. It was in this chaos that the command structure of the West suffered its most critical blow. King Théoden, the architect of the relief, was targeted by the Witch King. The Lord of the Nazgul descended, his fell beast striking the king's horse, Snowmane. The king fell, crushed beneath his own mount. This was the decapitation strike. With Théoden down and the Eomer separated on the far side of the field, the Rohirrim cohesion began to fracture. The Witch King landed to finish the kill, an entity radiating such terror that even the bravest veterans were paralyzed. The psychological weapon was once again paramount, but the Witch King's arrogance led to a fatal tactical error. He ignored the anomaly. He ignored the lone soldier standing over the fallen king. The duel that followed between the Ringwraith and Éowyn was not merely a clash of mythic figures, it was the exploitation of a blind spot. The Witch King was bound by a prophecy of invulnerability against living man, a belief that made him reckless. He failed to secure his flank. Merry Brandybuck, unnoticed and underestimated, delivered the stroke that unmade the spell. An enchanted blade of Westerness forged centuries ago specifically to combat the witch realm of Angmar, severing the tendon behind the knee. It was a precision strike that shattered the metaphysical protection of the Wraith. Éowyn followed with the killing thrust into the void beneath the hood. The captain of the Black Pit, the supreme field commander of Sauron, shrieked and faded into nothingness. The head of the snake was cut off. The psychological pressure on the Gondorians lifted instantly. However, the strategic reality was still dire. The Witch King was dead, but his army was not. Gothmog, the lieutenant of Morgul, took command with brutal efficiency. He threw in the last reserves, men of Variag and trolls of the Far Harad. The sheer weight of numbers began to tell. Omer, now king, found himself surrounded on a hill, fighting a last-stand scenario. The city was still sealed. The Rohirrim were dying. The mathematics of attrition were once again favoring Mordor. Then came the final movement of the symphony. From the docks of Harlon, lookouts spotted black sails unfurling against the wind. The despair in the defenders was absolute. They believed these were the corsairs of Umbar, the final nail in the coffin. But as the lead ship turned, the wind caught the standard. It was not the Black Serpent or the Eye. It was the White Tree, and 7 stars, and the crown. Aragorn had returned, and he did not come alone. He brought no ghost army to magically wipe the board clean. He brought the hard-bitten living soldiers of the southern fiefs. Men he had liberated by defeating the Corsair fleet at Pelargir. This was the checkmate. The arrival of Aragorn changed the geometry of the battlefield from a siege into an encirclement. He debarked his fresh infantry and struck the enemy from the river. The rear. Suddenly, the armies of Mordor were the ones trapped. They were caught between the anvil of the city, Nazi-Ham, the hammer of the Rohirrim, and the fresh blade of Aragorn's force. The tactical situation inverted completely. The Orcs and Southrons, leaderless and attacked from 3 cardinal directions, lost all cohesion. The end of the battle was not a retreat. It was an extermination. There was no quarter asked, and none given. The sun, finally burning through the clouds, illuminated a grim industrial effort as the forces of the West methodically liquidated the remaining pockets of resistance. By the time the sun set, the Ramas Echor was silent. The silence was not of peace, but of total annihilation. The greatest army to issue from Mordor in an age had not just been defeated. It had ceased to exist. The sun went down on the Pelennor, leaving the fields bathed in the copper light of a dying day. The noise of battle, the screaming of men and beasts, the grinding of iron. was replaced by a silence more terrible than the clamor. It was the silence of exhaustion, punctuated only by the cries of the wounded and the carrion birds descending from the mountains. The cost of the victory was inscribed upon the land itself. Great mounds were raised to cover the dead, segregating men from orcs, the honored from the vile. Snowmane's Howe rose where the king of the Mark fell, a green hill amidst the ruin. The tactical objective had been achieved. Minas Tirith stood. The siege was broken, but the butcher's bill was staggering. The Rohirrim had lost a third of their strength. The flower of their nobility lay withering in the grass. Gondor had lost its steward and many of its captains. From a geopolitical perspective, the battle cemented the alliance between the Mark and the Stone, in a way that no parchment treaty ever could. The oath of Eorl was paid in full, forged in a bond of blood that would endure as long as the realms of men lasted. Yet, in the cold light of strategic analysis, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields was a pyrrhic victory. The West had thrown every available asset into the grinder. They had emptied the garrisons of the South, stripped the defenses of the North, and spent the lives of their kings. They had defeated one of Sauron's armies, but the Dark Lord sat behind the Ifilduath, with resources that remained virtually untouched. He could breed orcs faster than men could grow grain. If the war remained a contest of attrition, the West had already lost. They had parried the dagger thrust at their heart, but they had no strength left to hold the shield arm up for a second blow. This realization birthed the final, desperate strategy of the Third Age. The captains of the West understood that a military victory over Sauron was a mathematical impossibility. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields did not win the war. It merely bought time. A few days, perhaps a week. The only path forward was to take the surviving remnant of this great army, a force now too small to defend the city effectively, and use it as bait. They would march on the Black Gate, not to conquer, but to draw the eye, to empty the lands of Mordor of their guarding armies. It was a suicide mission born of necessity. The legacy of the Pelennor was the understanding that swords and spears, no matter how valorous, could not save the world. They could only hold the line long enough for a small, unnoticed hope to creep through the shadows. The grandeur of the charge and the glory of the clash ultimately served only to distract the enemy from the true threat. The long defeat continued, but for one brief shining moment, the darkness had been held back by the sheer, stubborn will of men who refused to kneel.